So today's video is going to be a little different. I'm not going to talk about anything that's ethically relevant. Rather, I'm going to talk about argument reconstruction and specifically how argument reconstruction can be beautiful. This is something that I've been working on for a while, and so I kind of want to share it. I actually recently published a short book on my model of beautiful argument reconstructions. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is kind of review the aesthetic rules that constitute my model, and then I'm going to go over reconstruction and kind of reformulate it and to show you how I apply those rules. One thing that I want to clarify is that I'm not going to really go over the basics of argument reconstruction, okay? So you should already know what premises and conclusions are and what deductive arguments are and what validity is and what soundness is, okay? And for those of you who don't know what those things are, there are plenty of resources on the internet that can guide you through and teach you that material. All right, so let's take a look at a summary of my model. All right, here's a summary of the aesthetic properties that constitute my model of beautiful argument reconstructions. Generally, beautiful reconstructions are concise, linear, progressive, and nested when appropriate. Okay, and each property has corresponding general rules, which I list below. So the first is regarding concision. Propositions should be combined if doing so does not negatively affect flow or dialectical usefulness. Supporting arguments should be removed if they are uninteresting and unimportant to the main argument, and if the spirit of the main argument can be maintained. Propositions should be implicit if they are unimportant and uncontroversial. So I find that the more concise an argument is, the better it flows, generally speaking. Okay, and I think it's because the logic doesn't get as complicated, right? So if it's direct and straightforward, then you can see and understand why the conclusion follows the premises, right? You'll get like this, oh, okay, I understand what this person is saying type of moment, okay? So that is what concision is about. All right, so for linearity, broad premises should be listed first. If there are multiple broad premises, their order does not matter unless they belong to different arguments, in which case they should be placed in their respective arguments. And the third is conditionals should be listed first, but should be placed in their respective arguments. Okay, so linearity is regarding kind of like the flow of the reconstruction, right? So I find that reconstructions that start with broad premises tend to flow better. Okay, so let's take the classic example, right? All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? The proposition that all humans are mortal is a very broad premise because it's talking about like all humans, right? And then the Socrates is human part, it's more narrow than that. And then you have the conclusion. Now, I can't really explain why I find that to be more beautiful than if the first two premises were flipped, right? It just seems more beautiful to me. And the best way that I can describe it is that it better represents the certainty that deductive arguments are trying to show. Okay, and that's honestly the best that I can do to explain it. Regarding the third one, I think conditionals should be listed first because conditionals kind of set the stage for what obtains, right? And so in general, I just think that the argument reconstructions that start with conditionals look better and sound better. Right? A lot of this stuff is personal preference, and I have a hard time explaining why I think one way is more beautiful than the other. Okay, and it's honestly, I have the same kind of problem when I talk about paintings, right? It's like, why do I like this painting? Why do I don't like this other painting? It's hard for me to explain, but I'm trying my best. All right, progression. Every conclusion should be directly preceded by the minimum number of necessary premises that belong to the argument. Okay. Main conclusions should follow every proposition prior to them. Follow the trail of logic backward to determine if this is true for any reconstruction. So sophisticated arguments consist of multiple arguments, right? You have arguments within arguments within arguments. Think of like Russian nesting dolls, right? You have one doll within another doll within another doll, okay? And so arguments can be quite complicated. And so depending on how you present the propositions, it can get quite confusing, right? So I think the best way to do it and the most beautiful way to do it is to kind of show how the argument builds upon itself step by step. And for those of you who are familiar, you know that many philosophers will list the premises that a particular conclusion follows, right? Like at the end of the conclusion, right? It says, therefore, blah, 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 blah. And then this follows premises 1 and 2. Okay, that's really useful because it clearly represents and helps you understand the logic. All right. Now, another benefit of that is that you can kind of trace the logic backward to see if all the propositions are necessary for the main conclusion. Sometimes they're not. Okay, in which case I would kind of eliminate them or try to put it somewhere else, or maybe even like split the argument up into two arguments if there are two arguments in there. All right, nestedness. This is talking about nested lists, okay? A nested list is a list within a list, okay? And because sophisticated arguments contain multiple arguments inside, sometimes I think it's better to represent a sub-argument as a nested list. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about, right? So nested lists should be utilized when they are not distracting and can help the reader understand the argument. Different colors may be used to designate a nested list if it is helpful to present the argument clearly. And collapsible lists should be used when possible. Okay, so the different colors thing, that is going to be restricted by the software, right? So Word allows you to do that, but I'm using Substack right now. I have a Substack that's dedicated to argument reconstruction. And to my knowledge, it doesn't allow you to use different font colors. Now, regarding collapsible lists, I don't really know a good software that allows you to do that. Okay, so essentially what a collapsible list is exactly what it sounds, right? If you click on the particular proposition, it will expand it, and then you can see what the argument is that supports that proposition. Okay, and I think collapsible lists are useful because it kind of prevents the reconstruction from getting too cluttered, right? Because imagine you can have a nested list within a nested list within a nested list, right? And if all of them are present when you're reading the reconstruction, it's easy to get distracted and confused, right? But I don't think Microsoft Word has an easy way to create collapsible lists, so I don't really know what to do about that, right? This is just going to have to depend on what software that you're using, and I'm hoping that Microsoft Word eventually incorporates this like additional functionality, because I think it would be useful. So now what I'm going to do is move over to an argument reconstruction and then reformulate it. What I'm going to do is show you how I apply these rules to make an argument reconstruction more beautiful. All right, so here is the original reconstruction. 1. Basic goods constitute diverse categories. 2. Basic goods are primary principles. 3. If basic goods are commensurable, then they are either homogeneous with one another or reducible to something prior by which they can be measured. 4. If basic goods are homogeneous, then they do not constitute diverse categories. 5. So, basic goods are not homogeneous. From, right, this follows, premises 1 and 4. 6. If basic goods are reducible, then they are not primary principles. So basic goods are not reducible. Right? And this follows premises 2 and 6. Therefore, basic goods are incommensurable. And this follows premises 3, 5, and 7. So the first thing that I do when I look at a reconstruction is look at the general structure of the argument. Okay. And what I mean by that is I look at the conclusions, right? And see if the conclusions follow the minimum number of necessary premises for that argument. So what's the first conclusion here? It's 5, right? It's this. So basic goods are not homogeneous. This follows 1 and 4. Okay. Well, there are other premises listed prior to 5 that are not necessary for 5. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to take those out, like move those around. Okay, so let's do it. It follows 1 and 4. So let's take this. Let's take premise 1, right? Basic goods constitute diverse categories. Here, new construction. Let's do it right here. Okay. All right, and then let's take premise 4. If basic goods are homogeneous, then they do not constitute diverse categories, right? So that's going to be premise 2. Okay, and then we'll list the conclusion. So basic goods are not homogeneous. Okay, and I'll write this follows 1 and 2. Okay, now if you notice, the conditional proposition here is actually listed second. Okay, but according to my rule, it should be listed first, right? And again, I just think it looks better and sounds better that way, so I'm going to do that. Okay, so I'm going to flip them. All right, and then I'm going to delete this part. Okay, 1. If basic goods are homogeneous, then they do not constitute diverse categories. 2. Basic goods constitute diverse categories. 3. So basic goods are not homogeneous. This follows 1 and 2. Yeah. See, to me, that looks better and it sounds better. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. What is the second conclusion here? And it's 7, right? So basic goods are not reducible. And that follows 2 and 6. Okay, so let's take 2 here, move it down. Right? Basic goods are primary principles. And then 6 here. If basic goods are reducible, then they are not primary principles here. And then we can Right, it's the conclusion here. So basic goods are not reducible. Okay. All right. Notice again that the conditional proposition is listed second. So I'm going to flip them, right? And this up here. And then delete this. Okay. So now I'm going to say this follows 4 and 5. Right? If basic goods are reducible, then they are not primary principles. Basic goods are primary principles. So basic goods are not reducible, right? That sounds much more clear to me. Okay. All right. So let's go back up. So now let's look at the last conclusion. Basic goods are incommensurable from 3, 5, and 7. Okay. So 3 here says this. If basic goods are commensurable, then they are either homogeneous with one another or reducible to something prior by which they can be measured. All right. So far, we haven't done anything with that, right? So we're going to have to put it back into the reconstruction. Okay. And then 5 and 7 are the other conclusions, right? So this main conclusion follows the previous 2 conclusions. All right. So let's look at what proposition 3 is supposed to be doing in this argument. Okay. Now, for one, I notice that it's a conditional. Okay, so that already tells me that it should be at the top of something, right? And the other is that if you look at the structure of the argument, it seems to me that it is setting the stage for what obtains at the end, right? So the rest of the argument is trying to show that the consequent is false, right? The rest of the argument is showing that they're not homogeneous and they're not reducible, right? Which means that basic goods are incommensurable, okay? So that tells me that premise 3 should actually be at the top and the other stuff should follow after, okay? So that's what I'm going to do, and let's just see how that looks, all right? So I'm going to copy that, and now what I'm going to do is this. Boom. That's going to be on top now, okay? And now let's say the conclusion is this, okay? Basic goods. I like to put the therefore in the conclusion. It's just a style preference. So let's just do that. Okay. Now let's do that. 8. Okay. Basic goods are incommensurable, and that would follow. This follows 1, right? 4 and 7. Okay. So let's here change it. This follows 2 and 3, right? And this follows 5 and 6. All right, so one thing that stands out to me right now is that there is no proposition that denies the consequent of premise 1, okay? So it's implicit, right? So this is the consequent of premise 1, okay? They're either homogeneous with one another or reducible to something prior by which they can be measured, okay? There is no single proposition that denies that consequent, okay? It's a combination of proposition 4, basic goods are not homogeneous, and basic goods are not reducible, okay? So I think that proposition should be implicit if they're uninteresting or unimportant, okay? In this case, I think having a proposition that kind of combines the two is actually important in terms of the role that it plays in the argument, okay? So aesthetically, I think it's a good decision to add it, even though it makes the argument longer, okay? So that's what I'm going to do, all right? So let's just let's just put it right here for now, okay? So basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible. Okay? And this follows 4 and 7. Right? That's what it follows. Okay, and then I'm going to change this bottom one down here. This follows 1 and 8. Right? And 8, right? Because 8 denies a consequent of 1, okay? Let me edit that here. Okay, so again, now I think it is a little bit better, but I think we can make it even more beautiful, okay? By incorporating nested lists. So this, most of this argument is actually a sub-argument of the main argument, okay? And so I'm going to create a nested list and kind of show you how I think the logic can be better portrayed. So the first proposition should be the same. Okay, that's just going to be the first proposition. So let's make another one over here. Okay, let's go like that. Okay, let's restart the numbering here. Okay, basic. Okay, and this should be the second proposition. Okay, basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible. Okay. Okay, because that denies the consequent, right? And then should be this. Therefore, goods are incommensurable. Okay, this is the main argument, right? From a bird's eye perspective, this is basically what it's arguing, right? But most of the argument is supporting premise 2, right? It's trying to show that basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible, right? So that means there could be a nested list in premise 2, right? So let's do that, okay? All right, so now what we do is take the sub-argument and put it in the nested list. All right, so let's do this. We'll edit it as we go along here. All right, basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible. All right, A, if basic goods are homogeneous, then they do not constitute diverse categories. Basic goods constitute diverse categories, so basic goods are homogeneous. Okay, this follows 2.A and 2.B. Okay, if basic goods are reducible, then they are not primary principles. Basic goods are primary principles, so basic goods are not reducible. Okay, and this follows 2.D and 2.E. Okay, and then, so basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible. Okay, so that's just a combination of the two. So this follows 2.C and 2.F. Okay, so notice that this conclusion here, basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible, is the same as this premise, right? Basic goods are not homogeneous or reducible. Okay, so if there was a functionality for me to create a collapsible list, I would do so here. Okay, but Word doesn't allow it, or at least I don't know how to do it, so I just have to kind of present it like this, right? And if you wanted to, you could, make this a different color. I'm not going to do that here. I don't think it's necessary, but you could do that if you think it looks pretty. A lot of this comes down to personal preference, right? Because we are talking about beauty, which is subjective to a large extent. Okay, and I'll say this follows 1 and 2. So this is the final version that I have of the reconstruction. I think formulated as such, it flows a little better. It's a little more beautiful. And yeah, and if you're interested in following my work regarding argument reconstruction, you can subscribe to my Substack, okay? It's argumentreconstruction.substack.com. And you can also access my short book from that Substack. It's right here, okay? The Beauty of Argument Reconstruction. All right, take cares.